is this concept of a monolithic Islam, the idea that it's Islam versus the West or something like that. I think that even Muslims tend to think of Islam as monolithic, even though it's pretty clear that it's not. And I'll make the argument as we go along. But there's a group that meets. There's another State Department, I think, grant that funds a program at the university in the summer called the Middle Eastern Partnership Initiative, where a number of young people from Middle Eastern countries, Arabic-speaking countries, come to the United States. They take some classes on campus. They do some work. They've traveled to D.C. and New York and so on. And so in my lectures, one of the things we focus on is diversity and pluralism in a society. And the first time I did this, I had a very surprising encounter, because I casually mentioned that I thought there was more than one kind of Islam, and I got a very angry response. No, there's just Islam. There's only one kind of Islam. And then as the conversation went on, they started to argue with each other over what exactly that was. And of course, proving the point that at least to some extent, you can say there's only one, but the fact is it's as different as the people who adopt it. And so my emphasis in general is on establishing that kind of nuance, where we don't just class a whole bunch of people together on the basis of what some people do. Let's face it, there's plenty of times when I don't agree with my government, but people across the ocean might think that I do just because I'm an American, and I resent that. I don't want everybody to assume that I feel the same way as a whole class of people. And along those lines, I do want to say, as we proceed through the comments tonight, that we're really lucky to have scholars like this here, but it's important to keep in mind that no one person speaks for an entire tradition. And so, and I don't speak for all scholars when I present my viewpoint on this, and similarly our other speakers are both scholars who have at their disposal numerous traditional arguments and positions and ideas, but they're still, when all is said and done, they're still speaking for themselves. And I think they'll agree that we don't want to take anybody's comments as being universally representative. But when I talk about the diversity in Islam, it begins within really a generation right after the death of Muhammad. In the history of Islam, immediately after the death of Muhammad, the question arises as to who will be the caliph. The caliph technically means the successor to Muhammad. And Muhammad played two important roles in the Islamic community. He was a political organizer, a political leader, but he was also the religious leader. He was the prophet. But he was also understood to be, at least according to, I think, traditional Islamic theology, the final prophet. There's no prophets to come after him. So they did not have to replace him as prophet, but they did have to replace him as the political head of the organization. So that was the initial schism, and I'm going to put it this way, between what today we call the Shia and the Sunni, begins with a disagreement over not only what the role of the caliph should be, but also who should be it. There were disagreements over who should succeed Muhammad and whether it should be a dynasty in his family and so on, and whether the caliph had any religious authority in addition to any political authority. But the bottom line is that right away we find a schism occurring in the Islamic community. There are clearly two kinds of Islam. Now, the differences between Shia and Sunni today are not explainable by that origin story. In other words, the differences today, the disagreements, I think, are more, at least in my opinion, more geopolitical and everything than anything else, and are not clearly linked to those issues of succession to Muhammad. But clearly, at least, I think everybody can acknowledge that there are those two forms of Islam which do not get along with each other as a rule. Then we can also point out the various regional Islams. Keep in mind, Islam, and I don't know if this, I hope this doesn't sound insulting, Islam is a little bit like tofu. It picks up the flavors of wherever it's cooked in. So basically, as Islam is just a universal religion, is spread out all over the world, it's picked up many local flavors. And so it's pretty clear that African Islam is very different than Canadian Islam, is very different than Spanish Islam, is very different than Arabic Islam, because sometimes things that we think in the West are basically Islamic practices turn out to be more regional practices and not clearly identified with Islam. So, so that's clearly the case, and certainly one of the most interesting developments there, as far as I'm concerned, is the growing state of American Islam and what that's going to look like. And I think what we're seeing right here, how that plays itself out is, increasingly Islam is the fastest growing religion in the United States, and that means that increasingly they're going to be part of the discourse the same way various religious groups are part of the political discourse and so on, and social discourse. In addition to all of that, even within all of these various traditions, we also have interpretive differences, people interpreting the text in different ways and so on. Just to get to the point, because I do want to give room to my colleagues here who probably have a lot more to say about it than I do. But again, several years ago, we traveled to Egypt. This was the year before the revolution, so I feel so grateful for this opportunity because I just can't imagine having that opportunity again in the foreseeable future. But we met with the leaders of a number of Islamic groups and other religious groups in the area, and the thing that I took away from that was that of all these groups, none of them agreed with each other on almost anything. And so, again, that's where I first realized that this myth of Islam versus the West is just that. It is a myth. And certainly, there are political issues between Arabic countries and the United States, primarily perhaps over Israel, but these are still not religious issues, and we need to keep those differences straight. And when we look at the violence that we see in the Islamic world today, as it turns out, if you pay close attention, most of that violence is Muslim on Muslim violence. And I think what we're seeing is the Muslims themselves kind of struggling to establish exactly what Islam is. I mean, one of the comments we kept hearing in Egypt was that they wanted to distinguish the terrorist kind of stuff from real Islam and the language about the real Islam. And so the question is, what is that? What exactly is that? And how does that get communicated to people? And certainly the other question for us is how that gets transplanted onto, American culture and how we make room for that in American culture. And along those lines, again, so the thing I came away with was a reminder of an ancient Jain story of the blind men touching the elephant, and each person touches a different part of the elephant, and one person touches the legs and says it's like the trunk of a tree, one person touches the side and says it's like a wall, another touches the tail and says it's like a rope, and there are various versions of this story where they touch all kinds of parts of the elephant. But the bottom line is, up to that point, of course, they're all right. The elephant is all those different things. The problem is when they start arguing over that it's exclusively one or the other. At that point, they all become completely wrong. And so when we were in Egypt, I felt like I really got to touch all the parts of the elephant, if that makes any sense. That we've got a sense, not just what one person says it is, not just what another person says it is, not just what the media says it is, not just what our politicians are saying it is, but what we talk to students, we talk to practitioners, we talk to imams, we talk to grand muftas, and everybody had their own spin on everything. And I think so, I guess if there's a message that I want to take away from this, it's that we need to be thinking of people first as people, and then asking them about, if we want to get into the depths of their lives, that's a whole series of conversations that can't just, I think, be subsumed under a category like Muslim or Jewish or Christian or whatever. Anyway, okay, so I'll pass it on.